No one on that flight knew the truth. The baby crying in first class wasn't just hungry. He was slowly dying. Not from illness, not from lack of oxygen, but because he was refusing everything the world offered him, every bottle, every touch, searching for one thing that no longer existed. His mother was dead. The man holding him could buy hospitals, silence cities, erase bloodlines with a single call. Dominic Santoro was feared by governments, hunted by enemies, obeyed by killers. But at that moment, his power meant nothing. The baby's cries grew weaker. Passengers looked away, sensing something was terribly wrong. Then a woman stood up. She was a stranger, and she was carrying the one thing that could save the Mafia boss's son. By the time the plane landed, an ancient debt would be born, one that couldn't be paid with money, blood, or power. And once it was created, there would be no way out. The first thing everyone noticed was the sound. Not the usual impatient fuss of a baby annoyed by turbulence or hunger, but something sharper, thinner, like a plea that had been screaming for too long. The cry cut through the first-class cabin and settled into the bones of every passenger who heard it, an accusation without words. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. No one complained. No one even turned fully around. They all knew who was holding the child. Dominic Santoro sat rigidly in his seat, broad shoulders tense beneath a perfectly tailored black suit that suddenly looked too tight, too heavy, as if it were pressing in on him. Power usually clung to him like a second skin, even sitting still. He carried the quiet authority of a man who had never been questioned and had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Men feared him without knowing his name. Those who did know it spoke it carefully, if at all. Don Santoro, the head of a family that didn't officially exist and yet controlled half the East Coast's shadows. But none of that mattered now. The baby in his arms, Marco, was 2 months old and already too light. His tiny fists flailed weakly against Dominic's chest, fingers curling into the expensive fabric as if begging it to become something softer, warmer. His face was flushed from crying, lips trembling, the sound coming out raw and broken, like his body was exhausting itself from the effort. Dominic adjusted his grip again, rocking slightly, the motion awkward and unfamiliar. He had tried everything. The bottle the flight attendant had warmed with professional precision. The pacifier a nanny had insisted was the best on the market. Different positions, different rhythms. Nothing lasted more than a few seconds before Marco pushed it away, his cry climbing higher, thinner, more desperate. This wasn't hunger. Dominic knew hunger. He knew deprivation. He knew what it looked like when a body wanted something it couldn't have. What terrified him was that his son wasn't reaching for food at all. He was searching for something else, something Dominic could not give. 2 months ago, Isabella had died on a sterile operating table, her hand slipping from his grasp just as Marco took his first breath. Life and death had crossed paths in a single room, and Dominic had walked out with one and buried the other. Since that day, his son had cried as if the world itself were wrong. And now, on this plane, Marco's cries were changing. They were weaker, shorter, strained. Dominic's jaw tightened until it ached. He felt something dangerously close to panic curl low in his chest. Not the sharp, manageable fear of violence or betrayal, but something colder, heavier, helplessness. The one emotion his world did not allow. 3 rows ahead, Sarah Mitchell squeezed her eyes shut. She had been trying not to listen. She had told herself it wasn't her business, that she had done enough caring for one lifetime. But her body betrayed her before her mind could catch up. A familiar ache bloomed in her chest, sudden and painful, like a memory that refused to stay buried. She shifted in her seat, breath shallow, fingers gripping the armrest as if it might anchor her. 6 months. It had been 6 months since her daughter died in her sleep. The doctors had used gentle voices and clinical words, as if naming the horror might soften it. SIDS. Sudden. Unexplained. Final. Sarah had nodded, listened, signed forms with hands that didn't feel like her own. She had buried her baby and walked away from the NICU because she couldn't stand the sound of other children crying anymore. And yet her body hadn't let go. Milk still came, unwanted, unneeded, a cruel echo of something she no longer had. The cry from behind her wavered, cracked. Sarah's eyes flew open. She knew that sound. She had heard it in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning, had learned to distinguish it from hunger, pain, and simple discomfort. This wasn't any of those. This was distress. This was a baby searching for familiarity, for a heartbeat and warmth that matched a memory his body still held. Her heart began to race. Miss A, flight attendant, leaned down beside her, concern etched into her face. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah swallowed. She glanced back, just enough to see the man holding the child. The sharp lines of his face, the controlled violence in the way he sat still. The two men nearby who were clearly not just fellow passengers. Danger radiated from him. Every instinct screamed at her to stay seated, to mind her own grief and let someone else intervene. But there was no one else. That baby. Sarah heard her own voice, barely steady. She hesitated, then pushed the words out before fear could stop her. "He's not crying because he's hungry." The attendant blinked. "I'm sorry, I'm a pediatric nurse," Sarah said quietly. It felt like admitting something she had lost. That cry, it's not hunger. He's looking for comfort. For something familiar. Behind her, Dominic Santoro looked up. Their eyes met. The impact was immediate, like stepping into cold water. His gaze was dark, sharp, assessing, and for a split second Sarah regretted everything. Men like him did not accept unsolicited advice. Men like him made problems disappear. But then she saw it. Not anger, not suspicion, fear. It flickered across his face so quickly most people would have missed it. But Sarah didn't. She saw it in the way his grip tightened around his son, in the rigid line of his shoulders. This was a man who had run out of options. "What are you saying?" Dominic asked. His voice was low, controlled, wrapped in an accent softened by years in America. Dangerous, even now. Sarah stood before she could talk herself out of it. Her legs felt unsteady as she turned fully toward him. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. "I'm saying he's not refusing the bottle because he's stubborn," she said softly. "He's refusing it because it's not what he's looking for." "And what is he looking for?" Dominic asked. Sarah's chest tightened painfully. She thought of her daughter, of the warmth she had held, of the way babies learned their mothers before they learned the world. "Him," she said, nodding toward Marco. "He's looking for something that reminds him he's safe." Marco let out a thin, broken cry, then fell silent for a terrifying second, his breath hitching. Sarah's blood ran cold. She didn't look away from Dominic as she spoke the next words, because she knew once she did, she might lose her courage. "If something doesn't change," she said, "he's not going to make it through this flight." For a heartbeat, the Don of the Santoro family forgot who he was. He forgot the rules, forgot the eyes watching, forgot the blood on his hands. All he could see was his son. And in that moment, with his power stripped away, Dominic Santoro did something no one in that cabin had ever seen before. He begged silently, desperately with his eyes. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. The cabin felt smaller after Sarah spoke, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Dominic Santoro did not answer right away. He looked down at the child in his arms, at the way Marco's tiny chest rose too quickly, too shallowly, each breath a fragile negotiation with the air. The baby's cries returned, weaker now, scraping against Dominic's nerves with a dull, relentless edge. "You're telling me he needs comfort," Dominic said at last. His voice was calm, but something beneath it had shifted, like ice cracking under pressure. Sarah nodded. She was painfully aware of the distance between them 3 rows. A lifetime of difference. "Not just comfort," she said carefully. "Something familiar, something his body recognizes." Dominic's jaw tightened. He had spent weeks surrounded by specialists who spoke in data and probabilities. None of them had looked at his son the way this woman did, as if she were listening to a language no one else could hear. "And what exactly does his body recognize?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment where words crossed into territory that should remain unspoken. She felt the weight of the cabin pressing on her, felt eyes avert themselves even as they strained to catch every syllable. "He was breastfed," she said quietly. "Wasn't he?" The question landed like a blade. Dominic's expression did not change, but his grip tightened almost imperceptibly. Isabella's face flashed through his mind, pale against white sheets, lips parted as if she might still speak. He had not said her name aloud in weeks. Yes, he said, until she died. Sarah swallowed. Grief recognized grief with brutal efficiency. Then that's what he's looking for, she said. Not food, not a bottle, her. Marco's cry broke into a thin wail, and Sarah felt her chest ache in response, sharp and immediate. Her body reacted before her mind could stop it, heat and pressure blooming, as if answering a call it had never learned to ignore. Dominic noticed. He noticed everything. His gaze dropped, then lifted again, slow and deliberate. "You're suggesting something," he said. It was not a question. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She had imagined saying no, had promised herself she would. This was dangerous, inappropriate, impossible. And yet the baby's cries cut through every rational thought, leaving only the raw, instinctive truth behind. "I'm still producing milk," she said, the words burning her throat. "I lost my daughter 6 months ago. My body hasn't understood that yet." Silence swallowed the cabin. Even Marco's cries faltered, as if sensing the shift in the air. Dominic stared at her, his expression unreadable. In his world, there were lines that were never crossed, rules enforced by blood and consequence. This woman had just stepped over all of them without realizing it. "You're offering to feed my son," he said slowly. Sarah nodded once. Her hands were trembling now, though she clasped them together to hide it. "Only if you allow it, and only if you understand this isn't—" She stopped, searching for the right word. "It isn't something casual." "No," Dominic agreed quietly. "It isn't." Marco let out a sharp cry, then another, his small body shuddering. The sound snapped something inside Dominic. He had faced guns without flinching, ordered men to their deaths without losing sleep. But this helplessness was unbearable. "Sir," one of his men murmured from across the aisle. "We could land early," Dominic shook his head. "We stay on schedule." His eyes never left Sarah. "If we're doing this, we do it properly." Sarah's heart skipped. Doing what Dominic rose from his seat in one fluid motion, Marco cradled against his chest. The movement drew attention despite every effort to pretend otherwise. He leaned toward the flight attendant, his voice low but unyielding. "The first-class lavatory. I'll need it cleared." The attendant hesitated, then nodded, already aware that refusal was not an option. Sarah's breath caught. Reality crashed in all at once. This was happening. There would be no graceful retreat, no pretending this conversation had never occurred. She stood as Dominic stepped into the aisle, towering, controlled, dangerous even now. When he looked at her again, something flickered in his eyes, hesitation, perhaps, or something dangerously close to trust. "You don't have to do this," he said. It was the closest thing to permission she expected from a man like him. Sarah met his gaze. "I know." She followed him down the aisle, acutely aware of the bodyguard falling into step behind them. Each movement felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from a distance. The door to the lavatory closed behind them with a soft, final click that echoed far too loudly. The space was small, impossibly so, the air thick with tension. Dominic stood near the door, his broad frame nearly filling the room. He looked at Sarah, then at his son, conflict etched into the hard lines of his face. "I'll wait outside," he said after a moment, "unless you need me." Sarah shook her head, though her hands shook as she reached for Marco. "I can manage for a brief second." Dominic hesitated before relinquishing his son. The moment their fingers brushed as she took the baby, something electric passed between them. Surprise, awareness, an unspoken acknowledgement of how intimate this exchange truly was. "What's his name?" Sarah asked softly, adjusting her hold. "Marco?" Dominic said. "After my grandfather." The name carried weight. History. Sarah nodded, focusing on the child in her arms. Marco's cries softened as she cradled him close, his body already responding to the familiar warmth. Dominic stepped back, opening the door just enough to give her privacy. Before he turned away, his voice stopped her. "If anyone asks," he said quietly, "this never happened." Sarah looked up at him, surprised. For the first time, she saw uncertainty in his eyes, not fear of exposure, but fear of what this moment meant. "I understand," she said. The door closed. Sarah was alone with Marco, the weight of the choice she had made settling over her like gravity. Her hands moved on instinct, unbuttoning her blouse with the practiced calm of someone who had done this countless times before. Though her heart was racing. When Marco latched on, it was immediate. His cries cut off abruptly, replaced by soft, desperate sounds of relief. Sarah gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks as the familiar sensation flooded through her, equal parts comfort and grief. Outside the door, Dominic Santoro stood motionless. The silence where his son's cries had been was deafening. Relief washed through him, followed closely by something far more dangerous. Because in the old rules of his world, some acts could never be undone. And whatever had just begun behind that closed door was already binding them together in ways neither of them fully understood. The quiet came suddenly. One moment, Marco's small body had been taut with need, his cries sharp and desperate. The next, the sound vanished as if it had never existed at all, replaced by the soft, rhythmic pull of a child finally finding what he had been searching for. The silence was so complete it felt unreal, as if the world outside the lavatory had paused to listen. Sarah pressed her forehead lightly against the wall and closed her eyes. Her hands moved with instinctive certainty, supporting Marco's fragile weight, guiding him gently, the way her body remembered even when her heart protested. Tears slipped down her cheeks without sound. This was not her daughter. It would never be her daughter. And yet the ache in her chest softened. Just a little, as if something inside her had exhaled for the first time in months. Marco relaxed against her, his fingers curling into her blouse with surprising strength. The tension drained from his small frame, his breaths evening out, the frantic urgency fading into something quieter, safer. Sarah felt it immediately, the shift from desperation to trust. It stole the breath from her lungs. Outside the door, Dominic Santoro stood perfectly still. The silence was worse than the crying. It pressed in on him, heavy and disorienting, forcing him to confront thoughts he had spent his life avoiding. He had handed his son to a stranger, not to a doctor, not to a nurse under his employ, to a woman whose last name he had learned only minutes ago. And yet, his instincts sharpened by decades of survival had not screamed danger. They had gone quiet. He listened for any sign of distress, any sound that would justify barging in, reclaiming control. There was nothing, only the muted hum of the plane and the faint, steady rhythm of his son feeding. Relief flooded him so intensely it left him dizzy. Dominic leaned one shoulder against the wall, lowering his head just enough that his men would not see his face. In his world, silence usually meant death. But this silence meant life. Minutes passed, perhaps 15, perhaps an eternity. When the door finally opened, Sarah stepped out slowly, Marco cradled against her chest. The baby was asleep, his lashes resting against flushed cheeks. His mouth relaxed in a way Dominic had never seen before. Peaceful, truly peaceful. For a moment, Dominic forgot to breathe. He stepped forward without thinking, his hands lifting instinctively. Sarah hesitated only a second before carefully transferring Marco back into his arms. Their fingers brushed again, the contact brief but charged, as if both of them were suddenly aware of how close they stood. "He ate," Sarah said softly, unnecessarily. "A lot. He should sleep for a while." Dominic looked down at his son, then back at her. Something in his gaze had shifted. The sharp edge was still there, but beneath it lay something raw, unguarded. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied, already reaching for the buttons of her blouse, grounding herself in the ordinary motion. Dominic's hand lifted, stopping her mid-movement, not grabbing, not restraining, just a gentle pressure at her wrist. It surprised both of them. "Your name," he said quietly. Not a demand, a need. "Sarah," she answered. Sarah Mitchell. He nodded once. Dominic Santoro. The name settled between them, heavy and unmistakable. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as understanding fully clicked into place. The bodyguards, the fear, the authority that bent the cabin around him. She had known, somewhere deep down, but knowing and acknowledging were two different things. Dominic released her wrist, adjusting Marco with practiced care. "You saved my son," he said. "In my world, that creates a debt." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't do it for a reason. I just couldn't not. In my world," Dominic continued, ignoring the interruption, "intentions don't erase consequences." The plane began its descent not long after. Marco slept through it all, undisturbed, his small body warm and heavy in Dominic's arms. Passengers stole glances now, confusion replacing irritation. The baby who had held them all hostage with his cries was silent, serene. Sarah returned to her seat in a daze. The warmth lingered against her skin, a phantom weight she couldn't shake. She stared out the window as clouds slid past, her thoughts tangled and restless. She told herself this was over, a moment of compassion, nothing more. She was wrong. 2 days later, a black SUV waited for her outside the airport. Sarah stopped short at the curb, heart leaping into her throat as the driver stepped out. He was large, unsmiling, his posture unmistakably professional. "Miss Mitchell," he said. "Mr. Santoro asked me to bring you to dinner." Dinner? The word sounded harmless, civilized. She hesitated, glancing back at the terminal, at the life she could still step back into if she chose. The locks clicked softly as the door closed behind her. They didn't go to a restaurant. The city fell away, replaced by wide roads and iron gates that opened without pause. When the car finally stopped, Sarah found herself staring at a sprawling estate that looked pulled from another century, stone, glass, guards positioned with deliberate visibility. In-seat, the house was quiet, controlled, every detail curated to project power. A woman in her 60s met her at the door, introducing herself as Teresa, the house manager, and led her upstairs. Sarah heard the cry before she saw him, not as frantic as before, but still wrong. The nursery was bathed in soft light, decorated in muted blues and silver. Dominic stood near the window, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up. Tattoos marked his forearm, symbols Sarah did not recognize, but instinctively understood carried meaning. "He won't eat," Dominic said without preamble as she entered. His voice was tight, controlled to the breaking point. Not the bottle. Not anything. Sarah moved toward him automatically, the nurse in her overriding everything else. Marco reached for her as soon as he felt her presence, a thin whimper escaping his lips. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. This wasn't a one-time miracle. Marco hadn't just needed food. He had needed her. Dominic watched the understanding settle over her face, his own expression darkening with something like inevitability. In the old stories his grandfather had told him, a woman who fed a Dawn's child from her own body became bound to that child. Sacred, untouchable. He had dismissed those stories as superstition. Now, holding his son as he reached for Sarah, Dominic was no longer so sure. Sarah froze just inside the nursery doorway, the sound of Marco's thin cry cutting straight through her chest. It wasn't the same desperate wail as on the plane, but it carried a fragile edge that made her pulse spike. Her body reacted before thought could intervene, a familiar ache blooming, sharp and undeniable. Dominic watched her closely as she stepped forward. He did not move to stop her. He didn't need to. Marco's small arms lifted weakly toward her, fingers opening and closing in a clumsy plea that shattered the last of her hesitation. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to him. "He shouldn't remember me like this." "But he does," Dominic replied. His voice was quiet, stripped of command, carrying only truth. "He hasn't eaten since we landed." She reached for Marco, and Dominic let her take him without resistance. The transfer was seamless now, almost practiced, and that realization sent a tremor through both of them. The moment Marco was in her arms, his cries softened, his body turning instinctively toward her warmth, rooting with desperate familiarity. Sarah closed her eyes, The line she had told herself she would never cross blurred and vanished. "This can't keep happening," she said softly, though her hands were already adjusting her hold, soothing him with movements her body remembered too well. "You can't rely on me like this." Dominic leaned against the crib, watching his son calm in her arms. Relief flickered through him, followed by something heavier, more dangerous. "I don't rely on anyone," he said. Then, after a pause, "But my son does." The words hung between them, uncomfortably intimate. Sarah looked up at him, truly looked this time. Not the dawn, not the danger. A man who had lost his wife and was watching his child slip through his fingers. The thought unsettled her more than the estate's armed guards or the locked gates outside. She fed Marco again, slower this time, more deliberately. He latched on with quiet urgency, his small body relaxing as if surrendering to something it finally trusted. Sarah focused on him, on the rise and fall of his breathing, refusing to think about the consequences. Dominic turned away. He walked to the window, staring out at the grounds below, at men stationed in precise positions, at a world that obeyed him without question. Inside his chest, something unfamiliar tightened. In the old stories his grandfather had told him as a boy, there were laws older than contracts, older than blood agreements. Laws that did not bend for power or wealth. A woman who fed Adon's child from her own body did not walk away unchanged. He had laughed at those stories once, called them relics. Now, he wasn't laughing. When Sarah emerged from the nursery later, Marco asleep again, Dominic turned back to face her. His expression had hardened into something controlled, decisive. "We need to talk," he said. Her stomach clenched. "About what happens when he wakes up," she asked. "About what happens next," Dominic corrected. They moved to a smaller sitting room adjacent to the nursery. The space was warm, understated, deliberately chosen to feel less like a throne room and more like a refuge. Sarah remained standing, arms folded loosely around herself, as if bracing for impact. "You should go home," Dominic said first. The words surprised her. "You're letting me leave for tonight," he replied. "You didn't agree to any of this. I won't pretend otherwise." Relief washed through her, quickly followed by guilt. "And tomorrow," Dominic met her gaze steadily. "Tomorrow, my son will wake up hungry." The truth in his voice stole her breath. She had no argument, no solution that didn't involve herself. The realization settled heavily between them. "You're asking me to stay," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to consider it." Dominic replied, with full understanding of what it means. Sarah laughed softly, the sound brittle. "You still haven't told me what that is." Dominic hesitated. This was not information shared lightly, not with outsiders. But Sarah was already past the threshold whether she knew it or not. "In my family," he began, "tradition matters. Old rules, old debts. They exist whether we believe in them or not." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. What kind of rules? The kind that don't care about modern sensibilities. Dominic said, the kind that bind people together without asking permission. She thought of Marco reaching for her, of the way his body had responded as if recognizing something sacred. "You're saying feeding him wasn't just an act of kindness?" "No," Dominic said. "It was a declaration." The word landed heavily. Sarah's breath caught. A declaration of what? Of belonging. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "I didn't agree to belong to anything," Sarah said finally, her voice tight. "I helped a baby who was starving. And in doing so," Dominic replied calmly, "you stepped into my world." She shook her head. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." From the doorway, Marco stirred in his sleep, letting out a soft sound that instantly drew Sarah's attention. Her body leaned toward the nursery without conscious thought. Dominic saw it. So did she. The choice had already been made. Dominic straightened, his expression shifting into something resolute. "You will be protected here," he said. "No one will touch you without my permission. You will be compensated beyond anything you've known, and you will never be forced." "And if I say no?" Sarah asked. Dominic's gaze darkened, not with threat, but with something far more honest. "Then my son will suffer." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of it pressing down on her. She had wanted to save a life. She had never imagined it would cost her freedom. When she opened her eyes again, Dominic was watching her with quiet intensity, waiting. Outside the nursery, the ancient rules of a powerful family stirred, awakened by a bond that could not be undone. And somewhere deep within the Santoro Empire, men who respected tradition far more than mercy were already taking notice, because a woman who fed the Dawn's child was no longer invisible. She was essential, and in this world, that made her both untouchable and dangerously valuable. Sarah did not sleep that night. The room she had been given was too quiet, too carefully designed to soothe. Soft lighting, heavy curtains, a bed large enough to swallow her whole. It felt less like a guest room and more like a beautifully furnished holding cell. Every surface whispered wealth. Every silence reminded her she was not at home. She lay awake, listening. The house breathed around her low murmurs of footsteps beyond the walls, the distant hum of security systems, the subtle language of a place that never truly rested. This was not a home that slept. It watched. When morning came, it arrived without sunlight. The curtains parted automatically, revealing manicured gardens behind tall glass, dew still clinging to trimmed hedges like something carefully preserved. Sarah sat up slowly, one hand pressed to her chest, her body already aching in anticipation. She felt it before she heard it, a cry thin, insistent, unfinished. Sarah was on her feet before her thoughts could catch up. She didn't bother fixing her hair or reaching for the robe folded neatly at the end of the bed. She followed the sound through corridors that curved and opened like deliberate mazes, each turn watched by discreet cameras she pretended not to notice. The nursery door stood open. Dominic was inside, standing near the crib, his back rigid. Marco lay within, his small face pinched, lips trembling as he worked up the strength to cry again. He looked smaller than he had the night before, lighter. Dominic turned as Sarah entered. For a moment, the Dawn disappeared, replaced by a man who had not slept and did not know what else to do. "He woke up 10 minutes ago," Dominic said quietly. "He wouldn't take the bottle." Sarah crossed the room without speaking. She reached for Marco, and Dominic stepped aside immediately. No hesitation, no pretense of control. The baby's cry sharpened the moment she touched him, then faltered as she drew him close, his body reacting with an urgency that broke something open in her chest. This wasn't coincidence. It was recognition. Sarah swallowed hard. "This isn't normal," she murmured, more to herself than to Dominic. "He shouldn't imprint this quickly." "But he has," Dominic replied. She fed Marco again, slower this time, her movements careful, deliberate, as if prolonging a moment she already knew would not end cleanly. Marco relaxed almost instantly, his small body melting into hers, fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt with quiet insistence. Dominic watched from across the room, arms folded tightly, tattoos visible beneath the rolled sleeves of his shirt, symbols of loyalty, bloodlines, old promises inked into skin. He had never questioned the power of tradition, only its relevance. Now it was staring him in the face. When Marco finished and drifted back into sleep, Sarah lingered, holding him longer than necessary. She didn't want to hand him back. The realization startled her. She finally turned, offering Marco to Dominic with careful reluctance. Their fingers brushed again, longer this time, neither of them pulling away immediately. Dominic took his son, his touch gentle, reverent. "He won't last long between feedings," Sarah said quietly. "Not like this." "I know," Dominic replied. They stood there, the truth stretching between them, heavy and unspoken. Breakfast was served in a sunlit room overlooking the gardens. Though Sarah barely touched her food, every movement felt monitored, every choice magnified. Servants moved in and out silently, eyes downcast, efficient. Teresa hovered nearby, her presence polite but watchful. "This place?" Sarah began, then stopped. Dominic looked at her. "What about it?" "It doesn't feel temporary," she said. "Nothing here does." "That's because it isn't meant to be," he answered. The honesty of it unsettled her more than a lie would have. "I didn't agree to stay," she said carefully. "No," Dominic said, "but you haven't left." Sarah pushed her plate away, appetite gone. Because a baby needs me. And because you do, Dominic replied before he could stop himself. The words surprised them both. Silence fell. Dominic's gaze sharpened, as if recalibrating. You need a purpose. He continued more carefully. Something that makes sense of your loss. Sarah stiffened. You don't get to define that for me. Dominic inclined his head. You're right. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation, but not its resolution. You will have freedom within this house, Key, he said, more than most people ever do. You can walk the grounds. You can leave with an escort. With an escort? Sarah echoed. For your safety, Dominic said evenly. There are people who would see your presence here as leverage. The word sent a chill through her. Because of Marco, and because of me, Dominic added, later that afternoon. Sarah wandered the gardens under the watchful distance of two men who pretended not to follow her. The sky was clear, the air deceptively peaceful. She tried to imagine herself walking out the gates, hailing a cab, disappearing back into anonymity. The image felt hollow. Back inside. She overheard whispers she wasn't meant to hear, voices carried through stone corridors, sharp with disapproval. She's an outsider. This sets a precedent. Tradition is clear. Sarah paused, heart pounding, pressing herself against the wall as footsteps passed. She didn't need to understand every word to grasp the message. She was being discussed. That evening, Dominic found her in the nursery again, standing beside Marco's crib, watching him sleep. The sight softened something in his expression. They're uneasy, he said quietly. Some of my family. Sarah didn't look away from the baby. About me? Yes. Am I in danger? She asked. Dominic's jaw tightened. Not while I'm alive. It should have comforted her. Instead, it terrified her. She turned to face him fully, the weight of the day settling into resolve. I need to know something, she said. If I stay, if I keep feeding him, what does that make me? Dominic held her gaze, his voice low, steady. It makes you essential. The word echoed through her, final and inescapable. As night fell over the estate, Sarah lay awake once more, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere deep within it, ancient rules shifted, awakened by a bond formed not by contract or blood, but by need. And in the darkness, as Marco slept peacefully for the first time in days, Sarah understood the truth she had been circling all along. This house was not asking her to stay. It was already closing its doors behind her. The rules were not announced all at once. They surfaced quietly, like bones rising through the soil after a long rain. Sarah began to notice the change the second morning she woke in the Santoro estate. Doors that had once opened freely now required permission. Corridors that had felt merely grand felt observed. The guards always present no longer pretended she was incidental. Their eyes followed her with a different weight, not hostile, but alert, as if she had crossed from guest to asset overnight. Marco slept better now. That was undeniable. His cries no longer tore through the house in frantic waves. He fed, rested, and breathed with a steadiness that calmed something deep in Dominic's chest. Every time Sarah held him, the world realigned, and Dominic hated how quickly he had come to depend on that alignment. Hate, however, was not the strongest emotion at play. He stood in the doorway one afternoon and watched Sarah pace the nursery floor, Marco tucked against her shoulder, her hand moving in slow, soothing arcs along his back. She murmured something under her breath. Not words, exactly, but sound, comfort shaped into rhythm. Marco's eyelids fluttered, then stilled. Dominic felt it then, the shift, the irrevocable change. In the old tongue of his family, there was a word for this kind of bond. Not mother, not nurse, something older, something sacred. He had never believed in it. Power was real, money was real, blood was real. Myths were for men who had nothing else. But myths, he was learning, had a way of surviving. That evening, Sarah was summoned to dinner not by Dominic, but by the house itself. Teresa appeared at her door with quiet insistence, her expression carefully neutral. The dining room was larger than necessary, a long table polished to a mirror sheen. Dominic sat at the head, posture composed, but Sarah sensed the tension before she ever sat down. Other men were present, family, not by blood alone, but by allegiance. Their attention fixed on her with open curiosity, some with thinly veiled judgment. "This is Sarah Mitchell," Dominic said evenly. "She is under my protection." The phrasing was deliberate, protective, not explanatory. One of the older men leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Protection implies risk," he said, "and risk implies responsibility." Sarah felt the room tilt. Dominic's gaze flicked toward her, sharp but steady. "She is here because my son needs her." A murmur rippled through the table. "Need is a dangerous word," another voice said, younger, colder. "Tradition is clear. A woman who feeds the Dawn's child from her own body." "Enough," Dominic cut in. His voice did not rise, but it carried. The room fell silent. Sarah's heart pounded. She had known this was coming. She just hadn't known how much it would cost to hear it said aloud. After dinner, Dominic walked her back toward the nursery in silence. The corridors felt longer now, shadows heavier. "You should not have been exposed to that," he said at last. "I needed to hear it." Sarah replied, "Whatever it is they believe I need to know." Dominic stopped walking. He turned to face her fully, the dim light catching the lines of his face, the exhaustion he never showed in public. "They believe you are bound to us." The words landed softly, brutally. "And you?" Sarah asked. "What do you believe?" For a long moment, Dominic did not answer. He glanced toward the nursery, where Marco slept peacefully, a quiet miracle wrapped in blankets. "I believe my son is alive because of you," he said. "Everything else is secondary." Sarah folded her arms around herself. "That doesn't feel secondary." "No," Dominic agreed. "It isn't." Later that night, Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside her door. Low, urgent. She slipped from the bed and pressed her ear to the wood. "She makes them nervous," a man said. "She should. This is how queens are made or destroyed." Sarah's breath caught. She stepped back, heart racing. The words echoed in her mind long after the footsteps retreated. The next morning, Marco refused the bottle again. Sarah found Dominic in the nursery, frustration etched deep into his posture. "It's getting worse," he said quietly. "He waits for you." The truth hit her hard. She had hoped, foolishly, that time would loosen the bond. Instead, it had tightened. "I can't stay forever," she said. Dominic looked at her then, really looked, his expression unreadable. "I know. And if I leave?" The silence stretched between them. "Then my son suffers," he said finally, "and the people who believe in these traditions will come for you anyway." Sarah stared at him. "So there is no choice?" "There is," Dominic said. "But it's not an easy one." She stepped closer, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "You're asking me to become something without asking if I want to be." Dominic exhaled slowly. "I am asking you to survive." Their proximity shifted the air between them. Awareness sparked unwanted, undeniable. Sarah saw it in his eyes, the conflict. She was not just essential to Marco anymore. She was becoming something else, something far more dangerous. That afternoon, an incident sealed the truth she had been resisting. One of the younger men from dinner approached her in the garden, his smile polite, his eyes calculating. "You should be careful," he said softly. "Tradition protects what it claims, but it also tests." Dominic arrived before she could respond, his presence immediate, lethal. The man retreated without argument. That night, Dominic stood outside the nursery long after Sarah had put Marco to sleep. He rested a hand against the wall, eyes closed, listening to the steady breathing inside. In his world, some laws were written in ink, others in blood. This one, this bond forged by milk and need, had been written long before he was born, and it was not done collecting its price. Sarah began to understand the house by what it no longer allowed. There were no locks on her door, yet she never heard it open without warning. Her meals arrived exactly when Marco's feeding schedule ended, as if the house itself had learned her rhythm. The guards kept their distance now, not out of indifference, but respect. That was somehow worse. Respect implied permanence. Marco thrived. His cheeks filled out. His cries softened into brief protests, easily soothed by her presence. He slept longer, deeper, his small body curling instinctively against hers whenever she held him. Each improvement tightened the invisible thread binding Sarah to this place, and to Dominic. She noticed the change in him gradually, the way he lingered in doorways instead of issuing commands, the way his voice lowered when he spoke to her, not with threat, but care carefully disguised as control. He never touched her without reason, yet his presence pressed close, steady, unavoidable. One evening, as dusk bled into the gardens, Dominic asked her to walk with him. Not an order, a request. They moved slowly along a stone path lined with trimmed hedges, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Sarah kept her arms folded loosely around herself, aware of how isolated the grounds felt without the comforting barrier of walls. "You should leave," Dominic said suddenly. The words caught her off guard. "You've already tried that." "No," he replied. "This time. I mean it." She stopped walking. He turned to face her, expression grave. "There are people who won't accept this," he continued. "They see you as a challenge, as a disruption." Sarah laughed softly, though nothing about this felt amusing. "I didn't ask to disrupt anything. I know." Dominic's jaw tightened. "That doesn't matter. And if I leave," she asked. His gaze held hers, unflinching. "Then they will still come for you. Because you know too much. Because you fed my son?" The truth landed like a quiet verdict. "So staying keeps me safe," she said. "No," Dominic corrected. "Staying keeps you mine." The word slipped out before either of them could stop it. Silence stretched between them, taut and dangerous. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a mixture of fear and something far more treacherous. "I'm not a possession," she said quietly. Dominic nodded. "No, you're not. But you just said I said how they see it." He interrupted. "Not how I do." She searched his face, trying to find the line between those two truths. "And how do you see it?" He didn't answer immediately. The estate lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the path ahead. "I see a woman who walked into my life and altered it without permission." He said at last, "Who saved my son?" "Who reminds me of what it costs to feel." Sarah swallowed. "That sounds dangerously close to gratitude." "It's worse than that," Dominic said. "It's attachment." The admission hung heavy in the air. That night, Sarah dreamed of her daughter. Not the hospital, not the funeral, just warmth, weight, a small body pressed against her chest. She woke with tears on her face and Marco stirring in the crib beside her. She fed him in the dim light, rocking gently, murmuring nonsense words that felt more like prayer than sound. When he finished, she didn't put him down right away. She held him, breathing in the quiet. Dominic watched from the doorway. "I won't force you," he said softly. Sarah didn't look up. "You don't have to." The honesty startled him. "Then why are you still here?" She hesitated. "Because Marco needs me. Because leaving feels like abandoning him. Because somewhere between grief and fear, she had begun to care for the man watching her now, despite every instinct screaming that this was dangerous. "Because I'm already part of this," she said finally. "Whether I want to be or not." Dominic stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Then let me be clear," he said. "If you stay on your terms. No titles, no declarations, no traditions you don't choose." "And your family?" Sarah asked. His mouth curved into something sharp. "They will adjust." She laughed quietly. "You say that like it's simple." "It isn't," Dominic said. "But nothing about you has been." Days passed. The tension didn't ease. It deepened. Sarah caught fragments of conversation cut short when she entered rooms, felt eyes on her back when she crossed the hallways alone. One afternoon, she found a small silver charm placed carefully on the table beside Marco's crib, a symbol she didn't recognize, but felt instinctively was not a gift. She showed it to Dominic. His expression darkened. "They're marking you," he said. For what, she asked. For survival, he replied. That night, a storm rolled in, thunder rattling the windows. Marco startled awake, crying in sharp bursts. Sarah gathered him close, humming softly until he calmed, his fingers clutching at her shirt. Dominic stood nearby, watching the scene with something like reverence. They believe you belong here now, he said quietly, that you're protected because you're necessary. And you, Sarah asked. I believe, Dominic said, stepping closer, that if anyone tries to take you from this house, I will burn their world to the ground. The promise in his voice was not romantic. It was lethal. Sarah met his gaze, heart racing. She had crossed a line she could no longer see. Safety and danger had blurred into something inseparable. Outside, thunder cracked the sky open. Inside, the bond between them tightened, no longer forged only by necessity, but by choice one she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. And somewhere in the shadows of the Santoro Empire, someone was already preparing to test how far Dominic Santoro was willing to go for the woman who held his son's life in her arms. The first warning did not come as a threat. It came as kindness. Sarah noticed it in the way the staff began to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. How doors opened just a second faster when she approached. How meals appeared precisely when Marco stirred. The house was no longer observing her, it was accommodating her. That shift unsettled her more than hostility ever could. Because accommodation meant acceptance. And acceptance meant expectation. Marco slept against her chest in the late afternoon, his weight warm and steady, his breathing slow. Sarah sat in the nursery's armchair, staring out the window at the garden beyond. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended past the next feeding, the next night. The thought frightened her. You should be resting. Dominic's voice came from the doorway. He had learned not to startle her, not to enter abruptly. That, too, was new. I will, Sarah said quietly. After I put him down. Dominic stepped inside, his presence filling the room without effort. He watched as she gently placed Marco into the crib, careful, unhurried. The baby barely stirred, one small hand curling reflexively as if searching for her even in sleep. Dominic's jaw tightened. He had seen men pledge loyalty with less certainty than his son showed in that simple gesture. He's getting stronger, Sarah said, straightening. He's gaining weight. I know, Dominic replied. The doctor confirmed it this morning. She turned to him. You didn't tell me. I didn't want you to feel obligated, he said. The word struck deeper than intended. That implies I already am. Dominic did not deny it. They stood there in silence, something taut and electric stretching between them. Sarah broke it first. Your family has stopped pretending I'm temporary. Yes, Dominic said. And you haven't corrected them. No. The honesty startled her. Why Dominic exhaled slowly. Because they are no longer wrong. The admission landed heavily. Sarah's pulse quickened, a mix of fear and something dangerously close to longing. That's not fair, she said. You can't decide that for me. I haven't, Dominic replied. But I won't lie to you either. Later that evening, Sarah attended a gathering she had not been told was a test. It was subtle and intimate dinner rather than a formal meeting, held in a smaller dining room where conversation flowed more freely. The men and women present were polished, composed, their smiles carefully measured. They spoke to her politely, asked about her background, her work, her life before the estate. They listened too closely. One woman leaned in, her voice warm. It must be comforting, she said, to be needed again. The words pierced deeper than intended. Sarah forced a smile. It's complicated. It always is, the woman replied gently. Especially when a child chooses you, across the table. Dominic watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He caught Sarah's eye and held it, a silent question passing between them. Are you all right? Do you want me to end this? Sarah nodded slightly. She could endure this. She needed to understand it, but understanding came at a cost. Later that night, Sarah wandered the corridor outside her room, unable to sleep. She found Dominic in his study, standing by the window, city lights distant and blurred. You're being careful, she said quietly. Dominic turned. About you. That's the problem, Sarah replied. I'm becoming a vulnerability. His gaze sharpened. You were always going to be... No, she said. I was a solution. Now I'm something else. Dominic did not argue. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. In my world, he said, everything worth having is a liability. Sarah's breath hitched. And what am I worth? The question hung between them, intimate and dangerous. Before Dominic could answer, the door opened abruptly. One of his men stepped inside, his face set. There's been a message, he said. From the Romano faction. The air shifted instantly. Dominic's expression hardened, all warmth replaced by lethal focus. What kind of message? A reminder. The man replied, that alliances depend on stability. Sarah felt the chill run through her. She didn't need details to understand the implication. They're watching, Dominic said once they were alone again. They think you're a weakness. And are they wrong? Sarah asked softly. Dominic's eyes darkened. Yes, but he did not say why. That night, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. Not hurried, deliberate. She sat up, heart pounding, listening as voices murmured and then faded away. When she checked on Marco, he slept peacefully, unaware of the tension threading through the walls around him. The next morning, Dominic insisted she leave the estate for the first time since arriving. Just for a few hours, he said. With security? I don't want to be escorted. Sarah protested. You already are, Dominic replied gently. They drove into the city, the world beyond the gates feeling unreal. Too loud, too open. Sarah stared out the window, struck by how distant her old life seemed. At a quiet cafe, Dominic sat across from her, stripped of the house's authority, almost ordinary, almost... This is the last chance I can give you, he said quietly. If you want to disappear, I will make it happen. Sarah searched his face, and Marco Dominic didn't hesitate. He stays with me? The answer hurt more than she expected. And if I stay? She asked. Dominic's gaze softened, just slightly. Then you stop pretending this is temporary. Sarah looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor she could no longer hide. The truth had been closing in on her for days. She was no longer just protecting a child. She was protecting a man who had built his life on never needing anyone, and was now quietly unraveling because he did. When they returned to the estate, Sarah found a small object waiting on her bedside table. A simple ring. No gemstone, no inscription. A symbol of acknowledgement, not ownership. Sarah closed her fingers around it, heart racing. Somewhere between fear and desire, she understood the truth she had been resisting. In this world, loving Dominic Santoro was not a weakness. It was a risk no one survived unchanged. The ring stayed where Sarah had left it. She did not put it on. She did not throw it away. It lay on the bedside table like a quiet question, catching the light whenever she passed, reminding her that acknowledgement was sometimes more dangerous than possession. She had spent her life avoiding promises she could not keep. This one felt heavier than any vow she had ever imagined. Marco slept peacefully through the night, unaware that the house around him had shifted into something sharper, more alert. Sarah felt it in the way guards moved with less subtlety, in how Dominic's men spoke in lowered voices that stopped the moment she entered a room. Whatever patience the outside world had been granting them was ending. Dominic confirmed it just after dawn. He stood in the nursery doorway, jacket already on, his expression controlled but tight around the eyes. We have a problem, he said quietly. Sarah did not ask what kind. She lifted Marco from his crib and settled him against her shoulder, grounding herself in the familiar weight. How serious? Serious enough that I need you to listen very carefully, Dominic replied. She turned to face him. I am listening. The Romano faction is moving, he said. They've decided you're no longer just a complication. You're leverage. Sarah felt a chill trace her spine. They want to use me to reach you. Yes. And Marco Dominic's jaw flexed. They won't touch him. Not directly. That would unite every family against them. But me, Sarah said softly, I'm expendable. Dominic stepped closer, his voice low and fierce. You are not. The intensity in his gaze stole her breath, but she forced herself to stay steady. Then tell me the truth, she said. Not as the dawn. As the man who asked me to stay? He hesitated only a fraction of a second. They want proof that I'm still in control, that I won't compromise tradition for attachment. Sarah understood immediately. They want you to give me up. Yes. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken consequence. Marco stirred slightly, then settled again, his small hand fisting in Sarah's shirt. The instinct to protect him flared hot and immediate. If I leave now, Sarah said slowly, they back off. For the moment, Dominic replied. And if I stay, they will force a confrontation, he said. Soon. Sarah closed her eyes. She had known this moment was coming. The house had been warning her for days, pressing in, shaping her choices until only one remained. When you offered to make me disappear? She said, you meant it. Yes. She opened her eyes. Then do it. Dominic froze. No, this isn't a sacrifice, Sarah insisted. It's strategy. You protect your son. You keep your world intact. And lose you, Dominic said. Sarah swallowed. I was never meant to be part of it. That stopped being true the moment you fed him, Dominic replied. His voice softened, dangerously. And the moment I let you. For a heartbeat. Neither of them spoke. The air felt charged, fragile. I won't run, Sarah said finally. But I won't be used either. Dominic studied her, seeing not fear but resolve. The same steel he recognized in himself, shaped differently. Then we do this my way, he said. What does that mean, she asked. It means they don't get to decide, Dominic replied. And it means you stop pretending you're alone in this. The confrontation came that night. They gathered in the Great Hall, the Romano representatives arriving with polite smiles and carefully measured respect. Sarah stood beside Dominic, not behind him, her presence a deliberate statement. Marco was with Teresa, safely out of sight. But Sarah felt his absence like a missing limb. The Romani spokesman's gaze flicked to her, assessing. She's impressive, he said lightly, but unnecessary. Dominic did not move. She is essential. A murmur rippled through the room. You're choosing sentiment over stability, the man continued. That's not like you. Dominic's voice cut through the tension, calm and lethal. What's not like me is allowing outsiders to dictate the terms of my family. Sarah felt the shift, the moment when words stopped being negotiation and became warning. You fed my son? Dominic went on, his gaze never leaving the spokesman's face. You want to talk about tradition? Then understand this one. Anyone who threatens his mother threatens me. The word echoed. Mother. The room went still. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, but she did not look away. She felt the weight of the declaration settle over her, binding and undeniable. The spokesman's smile thinned. You're redefining dangerous ground. Santoro. Dominic inclined his head. I've always owned dangerous ground. The meeting ended without blood, but not without consequence. Lines had been drawn too clearly to be erased. As the Romani delegation left, Dominic turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, he replied. I did. Later, in the quiet of the nursery. Sarah held Marco close, rocking gently as the house settled into uneasy calm. Dominic stood nearby, watching the scene with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You just made me a target, she said. I made you untouchable, Dominic corrected. Sarah looked up at him. Those aren't the same thing. No, he agreed. But in my world, it's as close as we get. She glanced toward the door, toward the vast machinery of power waiting beyond it. And if they come again, Dominic stepped closer, his voice low, unwavering. Then they learn what it costs to threaten what's mine. Sarah did not flinch this time. She had crossed the final line, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of choice. And somewhere deep within the Santoro Empire, the first steps toward peace or war had already begun. The first morning without fear felt unreal. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the nursery, soft and unguarded, touching the pale blue walls and the small figure sleeping in the crib. Marco lay on his back, one fist curled near his face, breathing slow and even. There were no raised voices in the halls, No hurried footsteps. No tension vibrating through the stone. The house had exhaled. Sarah stood beside the crib for a long time, simply watching him breathe. The days that followed the confrontation were quiet by design. Dominic dismantled threats with the same precision he had built his empire. But without spectacle, alliances were renegotiated, boundaries clarified, messages delivered with unmistakable finality. No one came for Sarah again. No one tested the declaration he had made. Because it had not been a threat, it had been a fact. Sarah felt the change most acutely in Dominic himself. He no longer hovered at the edges of rooms, no longer watched her as if bracing for loss. His presence remained constant, protective. But something softer threaded through it now. Certainty. On the third evening after the meeting, Dominic joined her in the garden as dusk settled into the hedges. Marco slept inside, watched over by Teresa, whose expression had shifted from scrutiny to something resembling approval. "You should leave," Dominic said quietly, standing beside Sarah beneath the open sky. She turned to him slowly. "You don't mean that." "I do," he replied. "If you want to." Sarah searched his face. There was no test in his eyes, no trap, only honesty. "I won't disappear," she said. "Not anymore." A faint smile touched Dominic's mouth. It wasn't the sharp, dangerous curve most people feared. It was something rarer, something unguarded. "Then stay," he said. "Not because you're needed, because you choose to." She stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth without touching him. "You're giving up control," she said softly. Dominic's gaze never left hers. "No, I'm choosing partnership." The words settled between them, steady and deliberate. That night, Sarah slept without listening for footsteps. Weeks passed. Marco grew stronger, his cries replaced by soft sounds of contentment, his eyes following Sarah with unquestioning trust. Dominic learned the rhythms of a life not built on urgency. He held his son without fear of breaking him. He learned when to let go. The house adapted. Rooms once reserved for strategy meetings became places of laughter. The nursery expanded, filled with light and warmth rather than watchfulness. The estate no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like something closer to a beginning. One afternoon, Sarah found Dominic in the nursery, seated on the floor, Marco propped against his chest, listening with grave attention as Dominic spoke to him in a low voice. Not commands. Stories. She paused in the doorway, struck by the simplicity of the scene. Dominic looked up and met her gaze. Something passed between them, gratitude, recognition, a shared understanding that neither of them had reached this place alone. Later, in the quiet of the evening, Dominic led Sarah to the small chapel tucked into the far wing of the estate. It was understated, almost hidden, a space few outsiders ever saw. "I don't believe in grand gestures," Dominic said, standing before her. "They attract the wrong kind of attention." Sarah smiled faintly. "That might be the first thing about you that feels ordinary." He took her hands, not claiming, not binding, simply offering. "I won't ask you for promises you don't want to make," he said. "Only this. Stay. Build this with me." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle gently, without pressure. She thought of her daughter, of the grief that had once defined her days. She thought of Marco, alive and thriving. She thought of the man before her, who had learned that strength did not have to be solitary. "I'm not replacing anyone," she said softly. Dominic nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to. I'm not here because of tradition," she continued. "Or debt." "I know," he said. She drew a slow breath. "I'm here because this is where I chose to heal." Dominic lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, reverent and restrained. "Then this," he said, "is where we begin." They did not announce it to the world. They didn't need to. Those who mattered already knew. Sarah remained Sarah Mitchell by name, by choice, but she was no longer invisible. She was respected not because she belonged to Dominic Santoro, but because he belonged with her. Months later, Sarah stood at the edge of the garden, Marco toddling unsteadily toward Dominic, laughter ringing through the air. Dominic scooped him up, lifting him high. a sound escaping his chest that might have been joy. Sarah watched them, heartful and steady. This was not the life she had imagined. It was better. In a world built on power and fear, they had carved out something quieter, something resilient. Not perfect, not untouched by darkness, but real. And in the end, when the noise faded and the past loosened its grip, what remained was simple. A child who slept peacefully, a man who learned to love without armor, and a woman who stayed not because she was bound, but because she was home.